So welcome everyone to the Administrative and Operations Plenary. My name is Alyssa Cooper and I'm the chair of the IETF. And thank you for sticking around for this portion of the plenary. So I didn't get to go outside during the day yesterday, but I heard that it rained. Did anybody see a rainbow yesterday? No? So we have a rainbow over Montreal today. Thought we could use one. So our agenda for today, we're going to try to be quick so that we can get to the open microphone sessions. We'll have a host presentation from our meeting host here in Montreal, and then brief updates from myself, the IRTF chair, the RFC series editor, the IAB chair, the IETF executive director, the IETF LLC board chair, and the chair of the NOMCOM. We'll have a welcome from the hosts for IETF 106, our next meeting, and then we'll get to the open microphone sessions, and we're going to time limit the LLC board section and the ISG section to 10 minutes each so that we have lots of time for the IAB open mic. And I think as people who were reading the mailing list earlier today may have seen, based on requirements from the hotel, we have to be out of this room at 9 p.m., so we're going to have to cut ourselves off then, unfortunately, but we'll try to be quick in this early part so we have lots of time at the end. So first of all, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our meeting hosts, Comcast and NBC Universal. We can't put on these meetings without the support of the hosts, and as an additional perk this time, we had a lovely social event last night at the Old Port, so thank you very much for that. As I said, they hope that we had fun, and Glenn's going to come up and say a few words.
Hi there, I'm Glenn Dean from Comcast NBC Universal. I'd like to say to everybody that came out last night, I hope you had a great time. We had a lot of fun planning it, and Montreal's a great city to host an event in. So if you ever come back here and you want to be a global host, jump in. It's fun. I can tell you from experience. So it was a lot of fun organizing 105 and stuff. So much so, we've decided we're going to do it again. So I expect to see you all in Philadelphia in 2022, and yes, we are already planning the social. So.
Thank you. All right, we should do that. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for your ongoing support, and looking forward to going back to Philadelphia. We haven't been there in a long time, so thank you, Glenn. All right, so moving on to my report. 3 topics today. The first, we'll spend a moment on participant statistics for this meeting, talk a little bit about our ongoing experiment with open time in the meeting agenda, and we'll talk a little bit about conduct in the IETF. So here you can see our usual statistics for participation. We had 1,079 people on site at this meeting, eerily similar to the number of people we had on site in Montreal last summer. We had 1,078 people on site, so quite consistent. Not sure that was a goal, but we achieved it. We had 147 first-time attendees, pretty good number, and participants from 48 countries here this time. We started off the week with the IETF Hackathon on Saturday and Sunday. 280 on-site attendees, so this was our second largest hackathon ever. Not as big as the one in Prague last time, but still a fantastic turnout. People working on 42 different projects. It's become essentially a staple of the IETF meeting week for a good chunk of our population. We had the Hack Demo Happy Hour on Monday night where people got to advertise their projects and spend a little bit more time talking in depth with other participants about what they had accomplished. And the next one will be happening the Saturday and Sunday of the next IETF meeting, November 16 and 17 in Singapore. So the open agenda time experiment, people may realize that we've been doing different versions of this experiment for the last few meetings. At the last meeting, we had open agenda time on Wednesday afternoon, had a big chunk of open time. And based on survey feedback from the IETF 104 meeting survey. Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm not paying attention to what's happening. Better? Okay, now we're not giving people seizures. It's good. So after every meeting, we do a survey. Based on the survey feedback from last time, it was obvious that most people were more interested in more shorter slots of open time spread throughout the week as opposed to one long open slot on Wednesday afternoon. So that's what we tried at this meeting. We've had open time every morning from 8:30 to 9:45 with unofficial side meeting rooms that people can sign up for on a first come, first served basis. And we had the working group session starting at 10 o'clock in the morning. Even with this amount of open time in the schedule, we still had plenty of slots to accommodate the number of working groups and working group sessions that wanted to meet. In order to figure out what we're going to do next and if we're going to repeat this experiment or change it, we need more feedback. So when you get the email on the 105 attendees list about the meeting survey, which will be going out hopefully at the end of this week, please fill it out. Please give us your feedback, what you thought of this agenda, whether you like the 10 o'clock start, how you think we should be structuring open time in the future, and any other feedback that you have about how we can make the meeting experience better for you and more productive for you. You can also send feedback to the ISG directly if you don't feel like filling out the survey, isg@ietf.org. We hosted Hot RFC on Sunday evening. So this is a 2-hour session, which is filled with lightning talks designed to encourage brainstorming, help people find collaborators, raise awareness about new ideas, new drafts, new initiatives in the IETF, promote side meetings and bar-offs. There were 23 talks, and the proceedings are available online. Again, this is one of those events that seems to be becoming a fixture of the IETF meeting week, and a very big thanks to Aaron Falk for continuing to organize it so capably. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about conduct in the IETF. There's been lots of discussion on the IETF mailing, the main IETF mailing list about this recently, and lots of discussion over the last few meeting cycles dating back to IETF, the IETF 103 plenary that we had at the end of last year. We have guidelines for conduct in the IETF. They're enshrined in BCP 54. And this is just kind of the top line from that RFC. It says that the IETF strives, through these guidelines for conduct, to create and maintain an environment in which every person is treated with dignity, decency, and respect. I think there's actually a few notable things about even just this one sentence. In particular, this word strives, because I think the notion of creating a positive and enriching culture in the IETF, it's not really like a box-checking exercise. It's more of a journey, and it's probably a journey that we will always be on. It doesn't really have an endpoint. I think for some people, they've noted some particularly troubling interactions on our mailing list lately, and some even more troubling interactions off list recently. And so it might be that we're at a particularly challenging moment in this journey. For me, I think that means it's an opportunity to for all of us to think about what we can do to course correct, to make improvements, to learn from our mistakes. I know that there's certainly things that I can do better, and there's mistakes that I've made. I might talk a little bit about those in a few slides. But I suspect that there's things that we can do collectively as well. The IESG talked about this a little bit this morning, and we feel as the leadership a responsibility both for the toxic atmosphere that can sometimes arise, and for trying to make improvements on the situation. So we're taking this very seriously. It's been revelatory even for me these last few weeks to try to understand the full scope of all of the documents that we have that describe conduct in the IETF. And there are actually a lot of them, and they go back a long time. This is not a new conversation. This is a conversation that the IETF has been having for at least 20 years, if not longer. And these policies are not necessarily in harmony once you go and take a look at them. So if we go back to some of the earlier ones, the earliest ones, we have working group guidelines and procedures, which in one section talk about working group chairs being able to intervene to cut off disruptive behavior, both in working group sessions and on working group mailing lists. And the original RFC for that dates to 1999. Then we have the IETF Discussion List Charter, RFC 3005, which was written in the year 2000. And that one talks about inappropriate postings on the IETF mailing lists and specifically about unprofessional commentary. And that's the one that created this role of sergeant at arms and allows the IETF chair to designate people to serve as who can help to moderate conduct on the IETF mailing list. Then we have one about revoking mailing list privileges from 2004, which is focused on denial of service attacks that disrupt the consensus process on the mailing list. And in that case, it's the IESG which is responsible for enforcing that one. We have the guidelines for conduct, which I cited at the beginning. Originally published in 2001, that document was obsoleted by a version that was written 5 years ago. And this one is has more of the positive valence, talks about the aspirational, what we aspire to, extending respect and courtesy to our colleagues. And that one doesn't really have any enforcement mechanism or personnel. Then a couple of years ago, we did the anti-harassment policy and the anti-harassment procedures. And that one is more focused on unwelcome, hostile, or intimidating behavior. Actually goes into some great detail defining what behavior that constitutes. And that's the one that created the role of ombuds team to field confidential complaints about behavior among individuals. And then lastly, we have also the meeting photography policy, which is the newest one, which has a section which is about ad hoc photography in the IETF and how people can decline to be photographed if they want to be. So I think that's kind of the summary of all of the policies that we have about conduct in the IETF. There's been some recent activity to try to stimulate a more positive environment, and there's also a few ideas floating around just this week and going back a few weeks that I wanted to let people know about. So the first is discussion between the area directors and working group chairs about encouraging professional behavior in the working groups. This goes back to IETF 103 when we had a significant plenary discussion about this, and the IESG has been engaging with the working group chairs since then to try to figure out some guidance essentially to help working group chairs feel empowered to intervene when they see bad behavior in their working groups, and to try to encourage people to be polite and respectful. So that's something that the area directors are socializing essentially one-to-one with their working group chairs. We really wanted to do this as on a human level, as a person-to-person conversation with the chairs. And it's also something that we as area directors ourselves are using for introspection and thinking about how we're applying this principle when we engage in the IETF. We've gotten some assistance from professional resources. So there was a group of us who met earlier this week with an engineering manager who's responsible for positive community building at one of the organizations that participates in the IETF. And he provided an incredible wealth of insight about things that we could do. He had read 2 months worth of our mailing list, so he was well educated about some of what's going on here. And I think we may continue to rely on his guidance and potentially seek some other contacts from him to help us develop what we do here. We're also thinking about training in combination with that, potentially leveraging some professional assistance to do training for the working group chairs, for the leadership, possibly for others who might be interested in some training about how to handle specific situations, maybe some role play, some thinking about particular scenarios that can get tricky in the IETF. There's been some activity around rotating the sergeants at arms. So a couple of years ago, in May of 2017, we got 2 new sergeants of arms after the previous set had served about 10 years. It's time for a refresh. So at that time, Matt Miller and Ben Kadick agreed to become new sergeants at arms for the IETF discussion list. People may know Ben Kadick as the security AD. He was actually the sergeant at arms first before he became the security AD. So if you don't want to be a security AD, you might want to think about not becoming a sergeant at arms, because apparently that's the thing that happens. But basically, since Ben joined the IESG last year, he's been asking me to replace him. And it has not been the highest priority on my list for a few reasons. There were other things going on as one of those reasons. But also, it never really seemed like a burning issue because we have 2 sergeants at arms. So if there ever seemed like there was a situation where it wouldn't seem correct for Ben to intervene, then we always had Matt, and of course myself. I'm also empowered by RFC 3005 to try to help with the IETF discussion list. So, as many things in the IETF, didn't seem like something that could turn into a burning fire until it ignited, which I think it sort of has recently. So I'm in the process of looking for a new sergeant at arms. That's already started. I've done some outreach on that front already, and hope to be able to do that fairly soon. Another thing that I think we could do that's maybe demonstrated by the litany of policies that I went through earlier is to try to streamline some of the documentation that we have, how we talk about conduct in the IETF. There's quite a bit of discrepancy between all the various documents in how we talk about it, and so bringing some harmony to that set of concepts might be useful. And then finally, something that the sergeants at arms have talked about this week, and I think the working group chairs may have as well, is clarifying some of the escalation procedures. So in the past, it's been somewhat ad hoc as to, if you see bad behavior on a mailing list, do you email off list first? How do you send the signal to the rest of the community that something's being dealt with off list? At least among the sergeants at arms, it's been somewhat ad hoc. Like, if we had already sent a general warning on list, then maybe we would carry forward on list. But it hasn't been consistent in every case, and I think that's quite problematic, and that's on us to fix. So that's, I think, something that we can try to do across the board in terms of being more clear about what the escalation procedures are for all these different bodies that handle conduct in the IETF. So those are just some things that have been going on and some other potential new ideas. The IESG very much wants to hear ideas from you about what else we can do, how we can be better on this. So I encourage your feedback, either sent to the IESG email alias, to myself, come to the mic during the open mic. We really want to hear your ideas. There's a bunch more information covered online in the IETF Chair's report and other reports from various other bodies, so I encourage you to check that out. And Colin Perkins is next.
Okay, thank you, Alyssa. My name is Colin Perkins. I'm the IETF chair. I just want to give a very brief report on the IETF. So the IETF is a parallel organization to the IETF, which focuses on some of the long-term research issues relating to the internet. Importantly, the goal of the IETF is explicitly not to seek to develop or influence the standards process. Rather, we try to promote research which is relevant to the long-term evolution of the internet And we do this in the form of various research groups, the Applied Networking Research Prize and the Applied Networking Research Workshop, which try to bring academics into the IETF community, the IETF community. We have 11 fully chartered research groups, 3 proposed research groups. 6 of these are still to meet later in the week. We have the Crypto Forum Research Group, the Computation in the Network Proposed Research Group, the Network Management Group, the Network Coding Group, Path-Aware Networking, and the Measurement and Analysis of Protocols finishing up on Friday. If you're interested in any of these topics, please do go along. We've had some really good research groups earlier in the week. The Privacy Enhancements Group in particular earlier today had a bunch of stuff which was very relevant to the technical plenary talks. In addition to the research groups, we run an academic conference called the Applied Networking Research Workshop, which we organize in collaboration with ACM SIGCOMM. This took place earlier this week on the Monday. We had about 200 people attending the workshop. Really nice set of papers, which are all up online. We're hoping to do this again next year at the Summer IETF in Madrid next summer. Look out for the call for papers just after Christmas, most likely. Finally, we also run the Applied Networking Research Prize. This is a prize awarded for recent research results in applied networking research, which are relevant to bringing into the IETF, the IETF community. We had 2 really nice talks yesterday. Netta Rosen-Schiff gave a talk on NTP security with a paper on a protocol, on an implementation of NTP called Kronos. And TJ Chung gave a really nice talk on the role of registrars in DNSSEC deployments. We'll have a couple more of these prize talks at the next IETF in Singapore. And in addition, the nominations for the 2020 Applied Networking Research Prize will open in the September-October timeframe. So if you know of any good applied networking research papers, please look out for the call for nominations and let us know so we can bring those people into the IETF, the IRTF community next year. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Colin. And next we have Heather.
So you know what I'm going to ask, right? I've been working on this RFC format project for a little while. Is this new to anybody here? Okay, good. In case this is a first meeting for you and you're not familiar with this, I have been working with the community, with the RFC Production Center, with really just about anybody I can, on taking us from the plain text ASCII-only RFCs that we've been using for the last 40 plus years to XML as the unchanging underlying format and having outputs of text, PDF A3 as our archival target, and HTML, allowing SVG line art in black and white. No, we're not going to do color because color is stinking hard, and allowing non-ASCII characters. There is an FAQ, sort of a very high-level FAQ on the project available on the RFC Editor website. And we're now at that sort of that last little bit of aligning parts. But the RFC Production Center is targeting the end of August this year, not this August, to try and be ready to publish V3 documents. Now, whether the tools will be ready, whether the end-to-end process will be ready, there's still a couple of open questions about some details in the vocabulary. Whether all of that will finally align is a definitive maybe. But I'm still very much hoping that we'll see the capabilities available come end of August. I want everyone to expect that this is going to introduce several months of debugging as we all learn some new and interesting features and what to expect out of the new format. And it's going to increase the workload for pretty much everybody involved, for the authors who have more things to review, for the editors within the RFC Production Center who also have a lot more things to review. There's a couple of key links on these slides, and if you, as I told the working group chairs today, if you take nothing else away from my talk, I'd really like you to be looking at the XML to RFC v3 FAQ. It answers a lot of questions that people come to the desk and ask about, and I think it will help you and your authors and your doc shepherds and really just about everybody understand what's going on. A couple other really quick things that I'll jump through since I know we are tight on time. Last time I mentioned the service level agreement, that with the increased workload, it was extremely unlikely that we would be meeting that later this year. Now the LLC board has approved temporarily 2 additional editors, and we're still searching for those. As it turns out, the type of copy editors that the RFC Production Center needs to edit IETF documents are rather specialized beasts. And it's a little challenging to find folks that will be a good fit, but we're still working on that. Because the gods are unkind, Cluster 238 is expected to be releasing right about now. The last 2 documents are scheduled for the IESG telechat on August 8th, and that will drop about 2,000 pages into queue. Thanks. Implementation expected in Q3. We are requesting a formal exception to the service level agreement for Q3 and Q4 to just recognize that it's pretty obvious as we, the RFC editor, are the primary testers at this point and putting so much time into this, we're not going to get through the editing of pages. So let's acknowledge that. We can't really say, here's how much time it will take because the tools are still in process. We just don't know. So hopefully the goal is to just understand that reality, get that documented for future reference, and move on. I have been sending out satisfaction surveys. The whole purpose of that is vendor evaluation, and as probably no big surprise, we don't get a lot of response, about 17% response rate. Almost everybody has been very happy with the RFC editor. I think we've gotten one response that said, well, it was okay, but it would be better if you used GitHub. So in terms of the narrative trends, because there's sort of this open space of if you could do one thing to improve this, you know, what would you see done? Really, the one thing that we hear consistently is improve Auth 48. Now, what improve Auth 48 means, pretty much I think every individual who's ever put something through the queue has a different opinion on what that means. So this is a really big project, and I highly recommend that this be sort of the priority for where my biggest priority ended up being in terms of projects, the format work. I think this is your next big thing that you should pay attention to relieve this particular friction from the RFC publication process. And someone did say that more chocolate would be helpful. Just noting that one. Wanted to note that there is a project, if those of you who are following tools, that may know about the inline errata project. Code has been written by Soaring Hawk Consulting, that's Jim Schad, to create files with errata corrections inline, verified only. This is very sandboxy, and we're doing everything we can to highlight the fact that no, you can't refer to these as the final document, but enough people find this to be just useful implementation help that we want to make that available. So that's something that's happening now. I do have a call for comment open. This is the 50th year that RFCs have been published. And so as there was a 30 years of RFCs and a 40 years of RFCs, there's 50 years of RFCs out there. And it is waiting for your review and your comment. Elephant in the room, the RFC series editor has decided not to renew the contract at the end of 2019. I thought it would be it was fun to put together, well, what have we accomplished? Because it wasn't just me, it was this room, it was the RFC Production Center. And we've done some pretty major things every year since I started. We've finally gotten a new website. I don't know if some of you might remember the old website that was a little disappointing for a technical organization to offer. updating a style guide, which we had been working against a draft on for a very long time, getting digital object identifiers assigned. This was very important in particular to the IRTF. Going through the RFP process to award the RFC Production Center and publisher RFPs, getting the format specifications published and sorted out, developing digital archive partnerships. Digital archiving is actually a pretty specialized field, and it wasn't, while that is one of the key reasons that the RFC editor exists, to maintain the archive of this material ongoing in the future, it's not really our area of specialty. So we've partnered with the Computer History Museum and with the National Library in Sweden to just keep ingesting our documents and make sure we have other ways that they can be stored in perpetuity. And the new RFC format rolling out this year. I really wanted to thank you all so very much for making this list happen. I greatly appreciate your time. Oh, yeah. Thank you, truly, thank you. Now, some of you may have questions about some of what I put together, and rather than have them lost in what might be some engaging conversation later, we've got a couple minutes. If anyone has any open mic questions they want to ask me, now would be a good time.
Michael Richardson, I'm really excited about the inline errata stuff since I'm dealing with errata right now. But I was a bit dismayed when you told me we're not going to be able to reference it.
I do not want to see those as the key reference pointer within an RFC. No, I think that's a bad idea.
But I get a URL I can point people at.
Oh, there's URLs. You can talk about it, you can use it, but when you start going in your RFC and say, okay, my normative reference is foo, you're not going to point to that.
Got it.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Ted.
So, as you know, one of the things the AA stands for is appointments. In this case, we wanted to let the community know that Russ Housley and Barry Liba would be reappointed to the CCG, that Richard Barnes will serve a second term on the ISOC board. Thank you for your service there. And that Jim Reed has been reappointed to the ICANN RZRC. The last thing on the appointment slide is that the IAB is also currently seeking feedback on the IETF delegate to the ICANN 2020 NOMCOM. The previous person was timed out, so these are all new candidates. Please do take a look. On the document side, RFC 8546 and RFC 8558 were issued during this period. We actually talked about them in the draft stage in the last one, so I'm not going to go into them. As Heather just pointed out, 50 years of RFCs is currently in community commentary. There's also some other ones, the harmful consequences of the robustness principle, the principles for operation of IANA registries. That one in particular is just an update to deal with the IASA changes, so please don't assume that there's a major change in operation there. And lastly, a document on the long-term viability of protocol extension mechanisms. Both the Stack Evolution and privacy and security programs have been operating for a number of years, and they have fulfilled their basic goals. Each of them was an evolution of a previous set of programs, and our current plan is to conclude both of those in the near future and then carry out any future work in other programs or structures, just to let you know. There were 2 workshops in the recent time frame. DDR, DEDR, was hosted by Nokia in Finland in June, and a bunch of the explorations on it, all the papers are online, please feel free to take a look. Among the ones that we think are most pressing are really that the architectural changes implied in moving functionality up the stack mean that we're likely to see changes in deployment patterns that result in consolidation and centralization. Those in turn create fragility and other kinds of concerns. You heard some of the security concerns earlier today. The ESCAPE workshop, which has got a long acronym, was hosted at Cisco last week, and it was discussing web packaging and other options in the space of web content distribution, with a particular emphasis on the secondary effects on those mechanisms. And again, consolidation is a concern here, and one of the reasons that this was put together was to make sure that the technical community actually heard from the publisher community, which is often not a group that comes here to the IETF. As you know, the IAB is also chartered as a committee of the Internet Society, as an advisory committee to the board, and we have been consulting with them on a number of things, in particular, again, on consolidation, a matter that was raised in the Internet Society in the Global Internet Report. So the last slide on this builds on what Heather was saying earlier about the RFC series editor search. First, we regret that we're having to do a search, and we want to make sure that we engage in an open discussion with you on how we can move forward. There's a lot of time at the end of this for that, but as noted in the conversation with John Clenson and again with Brian Carpenter later, we don't think that that conversation is going to end tonight. There are other people who can't be in this room with us, either for geographic reasons, time reasons, or because they're parts of communities who are customers rather than authors of RFCs, and it will take some time to carry out that conversation. There is, however, a time-critical decision to be made on whether to go ahead with the recruitment of a new RSC to facilitate the discussion on what changes might be made, and in particular to be present in the system until community discussion on the larger issues may have concluded. The other possibility there is to leave the RFP unissued for a period of time while the community discussion goes forward. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to have a bit of discussion tonight to kick off that particular time-critical part of it. Olaf Kolkman, who served as the acting RSC earlier and is one of the two editors of the currently governing document 6635, will present a very short review of the current model for those of you who may not understand how the different moving parts work together, and frankly, some of it is pretty complicated. And we hope then to use the open mic time productively to see how we can make this go better in the future. Thank you.
Portia.
Hello, everyone. As Alyssa mentioned, I'd like to thank our global hosts and the hosts for this meeting, Comcast and NBC Universal. And we definitely appreciate our hosts for this meeting and the social last night. Thank you very much. Good to see you. And our bronze sponsor is VeriSign for this meeting. Thank you. And certainly connectivity sponsors, Metro Optic, OpenFace, and TELUS. And of course, we couldn't hold the meeting without the equipment. And I'm not sure if you all had a chance to make it to the BOF earlier, but it's that equipment that is donated by the sponsors that really make each meeting seamless, because the equipment is taken from one place to the other, and it just makes a big difference in how the internet is coming into the venue. And in particular for this meeting, Juniper Networks has donated new MX204 routers, and I'd like to recognize Ron Bonifka for making that happen, and as well Warren Kumari, Colin Doyle and Rennie Bush, who facilitated the donation. So thank you to them. And for the Sisters Program, Comcast and Fastly, and the Fairmont as the welcome reception supporter. The hackathon. We have a new hackathon sponsor. ICANN made a huge contribution to this meeting and to the success of the hackathon. Thank you very much. And of course, Cisco DevNet for continued support, and NovaFlow for supporting as well. Our contributors to the code sprint are listed there. Thank you for your time and expertise. And of course, the NOC team, that includes our line speed vendor, Mideco, and also, of course, the volunteers who work tirelessly to bring the network to everyone for the venue. Thank you. And we mentioned this the last time, but the next meeting that we have will be in IETF 106 in Singapore. And thank you, Nokia, for being our host for that meeting. And I think we're going to hear from them later. Yeah. And of course, all of our global hosts for always being there to make the meeting successful. We appreciate you. Thank you. This slide just shows our future meetings that are coming up. If you're interested in sponsoring a meeting, please contact the sponsoring team, or you can send an email directly to the executive director at IETF.org. And this is a quick meetings snapshot of what's going on so far. Paid attendance is 1,059, remote participants 651, visa LOIs that were issued 166. And then for registration revenue, it's 779,105, which is 97,730 above the budget. So we are really happy about that. And then sponsorship came just under our target, but those were our numbers for that. And again, the registration breakdown. Thank you.
Thank you, Portia. And next we have Jason.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. So we've gotten a lot done. So we've been in place now for 4 months, and bootstrapping an organization is always fun, and there's a lot of work activity at the beginning, and we're in that highly intensive phase. So I have a bunch of updates to provide. First, who is on the board? You'll see some of us on the stage. Peter later on. Peter is remote, so you'll see him on the video screen, and Maya is here as well. In addition, of course, to Alyssa and Sean from the community. You may not recognize Sean. He doesn't have a beard. I have to say I'm still freaked out by that. So it's sort of a problem. I'll have to work through it. We are, in terms of the meeting schedule, we're trying to do a couple things here. First, we're trying to provide a lot more advance notice of when we're meeting and then what we're going to be working on. So we're doing a lot better in terms of publishing an advanced schedule of meetings and, of course, agendas. And we're working to get better there. So that's one of the improvements the community asked for. We've gotten a lot of work done. So we had a 2-day board meeting in May to kick everything off. We did some assessments to basically look at our strengths and weaknesses as an organization and the external environment and how it may affect the IETF in the long term and how we want to mitigate those risks to the extent there are any. We issued a bunch of RFPs. We began a search for an executive director, and I'll give detailed updates on some of these later. We put in place a whole bunch of insurance coverages that are required and that were also recommended. We began a policy consultation process and created a consultation process as well. Of course, we had the unexpected export regulation thing come up, and so we had to deal with that on an ad hoc basis. And we've done some contract extensions, and I'll talk later about the last item. So in the next few months, what does the next few months look like for us? We've got an executive director, a permanent one, to put in place. We need to institute and finalize the policies that we have and a bunch of other things that are here. It's a lot. And so I'm going to talk about some of the details in a second. This is the budget and where we stand. All of these, every time that we meet, every month we publish these. Suffice to say, basically, we're on budget. That's really the key message here. You don't need to know much more for now. The budget process for 2020 is about to begin. And I guess I would really say to the interim board that preceded us, thanks for putting us in a good position, and thanks for ISOC support and sponsor support, for basically putting us on a firm footing for this year where we don't feel like we've just formed and we have to go ask for more money or something like that. So 2020 budgeting will be important for us. In terms of operating reserve, this has been talked about before. We have one. That's good. As of now, it's really invested in short-term instruments. And so one of the to-do items or actions that we have is to develop an investment policy strategy to really guide what do we do with that money, how much of it has to be in a short-term investment so you can get at it quickly if you need to in an emergency versus what can be invested on a more long-term basis. In terms of the endowment, this is really new news, so thank you to ISOC. Just days ago, they were able to complete the transition of the IETF endowment from the Internet Society to the IETF, and that was a big deal. It took a lot of doing on the part of ISOC staff, and we really appreciate that. I will say that these numbers, as you look at them, probably don't make much sense. In some cases, they don't really quite add up because of some of the oddities here. And I will sort of say that the key here is that the current balance is what's important to pay attention to. We have roughly $3 million in the endowment. And if our goal is to be able to fund annual operations out of the income generated by the endowment, we have nowhere near enough money. So we need to really, in the next few months, in the next year, develop a strategy for how are we going to go about raising more funds for this endowment so that that might become a possibility. And of course, as well, how should that money be invested over time? Similar to the fund that we talked about a moment ago, this reserve, for the endowment itself, we need an investment policy. And at the current time, we've really just mirrored how ISOC had that money invested as a placeholder until we can get to focus on this. So we've got a lot to do. Of course, we reached out to the major donors, and I think it's important to recognize their generosity so far. That's really important, both the individual donors as well as the institutional organizations that backed the endowment. And we appreciate that, and we'll be working with them as we develop this sort of future strategy and figuring out what new organizations might be future donors for this. The Secretariat Services RFP, we put that out. Obviously, the current Secretariat's been doing a fantastic job. This meeting is another example of how smoothly everything just runs. It's great. It just sort of happens and works, which is wonderful. But we did happen to notice that the current contract ended first rather soon, and also a matter of a few weeks before the next IETF meeting, and we thought that was sort of problematic and unnecessarily risky, so we extended it to the end of the year, and that gave us a little bit more time to issue the RFP. And the other thing that we're trying to do is to try to simplify over time the way that some of the contracts are structured. Over time, just as things happen, a lot of things got bundled up into contracts, and it can make things complicated to understand, and so we've tried to break those up. And it's not any reflection that things are going badly in any sense. It's just we're trying to simplify things and make them easier to manage and administer. This is a big one. So the search for a permanent executive director, the key here is really astounding. 134 applications. We were blown away by this. We were very worried that we would have too few applicants. And so from my standpoint, I am incredibly humbled that we had 134 very qualified applicants for this role. And of that, as we went through, we had a very difficult time doing a first cut of those candidates to sort of pick the ones that should be interviewed in the first round. And I think it's a great reflection on the strength of this community and what the IETF means to the internet and to the world, that so many highly qualified people said they're interested in this position, and I think that's just a great thing. It just means that in the short term for us, we've got a lot of work to do to sort of sort through all of those candidates. But it's amazing to me, and I think we're, again, as I said, really humbled by the level of interest in that, and it's really great. Policies consultation, so we began that in the early part of June, and this was the first time that we did it. So the first thing we did up front is said, what should our process look like for consultation? This came out really in the IASA 2 working group, the expectations that the community had about how they wanted to be involved and consulted with. And so we created a project on GitHub. That's where the documents went. People could submit issues there if they wanted to. We also created a general consultation email list, and comments could go there. We did a live webinar, which was then recorded and available for people to watch later on. And we began then a month-long consultation period. And where we stand now, we've been a bit busy preparing for this meeting, so we've collected a bunch of those things, and over the coming weeks we'll be reviewing them and then deciding which of the policies need to be revised and whether those revisions get to a level of significance where we need to go out again for consultation. And I don't think we know that yet. And then as a last item, not only do we then have to implement the policies, but we have to put first meaningful training or information sharing about what those mean and how to comply with them, but then sort of a checkup compliance policy on the back end so that we're actually following those things, which is important. So I think those are all the updates. Here are all the many, many ways to follow us, how to contact us, and this stuff. You can find this all online. So no need to hash this out. But those are the updates, and we'll be up on stage later on to take any questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Next, we have Victor.
All right, this will be a quick update on the NomCom committee that we're forming for this upcoming selection year. First of all, I like coming to Montreal in the summer. It's a much nicer time of year, and it's a nice place to gather for the first time with the new committee. The NomCom. We've got our NomCom selections in terms of the voting members and non-voting members have all ready to go. I've met them all this week. It's been great. The band is together, and we're ready to do a lot of work this year. It's a lot of work for the folks. They're going to put in a lot of time, and I'm very, very happy with the momentum we have. This is a list of the both voting and non-voting members. If actually you don't mind standing up in the audience so people can recognize them for their hard work, as they're going to be in many, many meetings. They've decided to slave a little extra for the next year. So I'm excited as we get going. We've convinced them to volunteer, and they have, and we get to take a lot of feedback. And so we'll be spending a lot of time reading through all the community feedback. We enjoy having a lot of feedback. I'll remind the community many times that we will love to have feedback. It's the way we're able to understand what the community needs and wants, and for us to be able to do the right thing for the community. For this upcoming year, we have a number of positions to fill. That includes the IAB. We have 6 positions there. Listed also are the IASG positions and the area director positions that we're going to fill for this year. We are also going to fill a single LLC board member position and an IETF trust position. Those are 3-year selections, whereas the standard 2-year apply for the IAB and the IASG. When we're ready and we have the nominees available. And we will do the call later on in August. I'll pull up the current draft schedule in a moment. We're going to ask the community to go up to the website and please bring in your feedback. Please be diligent if you can, be expressive, and provide as many details as you can. That helps us kind of whittle through and understand what is it that you're thinking, what is it that you want. This is a quick list. It's on the web page. It's a little hard to read here. Font's a little small, but we have a proposed schedule. We'll get that hardened out over the next couple of weeks and make sure we have it firmed up. A lot of work as we get into the next couple of months. We'll get the questionnaires done. We'll do the call for nominees, and we'll prepare for interviews, or the majority of interviews in Singapore. So that'll be a big week for the NomCom. Just so folks understand, the first year, which was last year, we filled a 1, a 2, and a 3-year role for both the IETF Trust and the LLC, and that was to be able to seed it so that we can have a single nominee moving forward each successive year. So this year we'll fill the 1 role, as I mentioned earlier, but last year we had done the 3 on a one-time basis to kind of seed it so that we'll have an offsetting cast of board members. So as a reminder, feedback is amazing. I put it 3 times there, so you can see how important it is. The other thing I would like to remind everyone is, please, 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 if you know someone who's qualified and you think that they would be a great candidate for one of the roles, please nominate them. You can technically nominate yourself as well if you feel you're qualified. But please look around, talk to your fellow IETFers. It's great to have a wide cast of nominees. It's a great experience to go through it. Even if you're a little timid, please try. We need qualified candidates. We need a lot of help, and I love to see lots of candidates. So nudge your friends. That's it. Kept it short.
Thank you, Victor. Julian is next.
Actually, any feedback or no questions? Comments on the NomCom?
Yeah, we're not taking Q&A on the NomCom. Thanks.
Good afternoon. So for IETF 106, Nokia will be pleased to welcome you in Singapore. So Nokia is not immediately related to Singapore, but we do have a location out there which is serving the Asian markets, so we are kind of locals. Singapore in November, so we've already been there. We know how it is. It's an enjoyable place. We know that there is a diverse culture, plenty of good food, and we may not notice when we are freezing in our meeting rooms, but it's also tropical weather out there. So you will find out that there are tropical forests and you have beaches. So you can get ready for that if you're not too busy working. We'll have during the meeting we'll have a social event just across the bay from the hotel in the Singapore Art Science Museum. They have an exhibition called Future World, where art meets science, which is very apt for IETF. And I know that you have a lot to discuss tonight, so I will not take much more time. See you in Singapore. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. So we're on to the open mic portion, so we need the LLC board to come on up. Liz has, you're the MC for this, my friend, you're the chair.
Okay. Sorry, can you start a timer? Okay, open mic. Yeah, Peter is on the video, right?
Do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yep. So if you can introduce yourself.
Sean Turner.
Jason Livingood. Yeah. Maybe.
Alyssa Cooper.
Maya Jeffries.
And do we have?
And Peter? Hello? We have a question on the screen? Okay.
So I think you have to let.
Oh, I can see it.
Hi. So I know there are a lot of important topics coming up that a lot of people
informative for everyone. And I wanted to recommend, in the interest of time and audibility, ask folks to say while clapping or cheering till the very end, just so we can hear everything that everyone has to say. Thanks.
Thanks. All right.
Leslie Daigle. Jason, you mentioned in your remarks that among the things that the very, very busy new LLC board is doing is looking at planning how to simplify the contracts. I'd kind of like to hear that expressed in terms of what is the strategic level objective that the LLC board has, and how is your new executive director going to implement it?
So, like, why are we simplifying or splitting?
Why is the LLC board worried about what the contracts look like? It seems to me that that's dangerously close to getting into the kind of nitpicking stuff as opposed to the high-level strategic stuff that the LLC board was designed to do. But I may have missed the point, and I'd like to hear how you have a strategic objective that you're going to get the new executive director to implement.
From a contract standpoint, it's sort of, the more complicated that you make a contract, the harder it is to understand, the harder it is to make sure that everyone agrees and is aligned on what the responsibilities are and so on. So I think that's the idea in breaking them apart, is making them a little bit simpler, more comprehensible.
Okay, so what you're telling me, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that the LLC board would like to ensure that there is ease and clarity for all to understand the contracts, and this is a high-level priority in the establishment of this organization.
It's a high-level objective. It's part of the normal, legal aspect of the administration of this stuff, yeah.
Right, well, I'll probably see you on the next plenary mic. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, Jason. Elliot Beer here. Can people? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So as people may have seen on the IETF list, I've put out a draft called Draft Lear. We got to stop meeting like this. Now, the purpose of that draft is really simply to engage the LLC to start, and the ED perhaps, to start thinking about new modalities of how we should be meeting with an eye towards not only effectiveness, but also how we preserve the environment, cost, and a litany of other things. The purpose of the draft is not to specify answers. In fact, I don't even know if I have the right questions in the draft, but rather to have somebody who can look at this in a long-term way. As you put up a list of meeting dates, we tend to get backed up in terms of thinking 3, 4, 5 years in advance. So any change we might want to even consider, even at an experimental level, can take a while. So the purpose of me standing here is to say, first of all, could the community please perhaps provide some comment on that draft, and then perhaps could you take that forward as you see fit in consultations with the IESG?
Yep, thanks. I'll say certainly we definitely noticed the draft. I thought it was interesting to read, and we're watching all the community discussions. So, as community consensus develops, that will help provide direction. Timing-wise, to the extent that we wanted to follow some of your recommendations, for example, around a consultant to help do some assessment or something, given that we're beginning the budget process soon, the timing may be convenient between now and the end of year if something like that wanted to be budgeted. But we'll certainly keep an eye on what the community discussion is and assess, how to move forward. Thanks. And do you want to add something?
One thing, we have a meeting location policy, which calls for specific rotation on specific time scale. So there is some intersection between your proposal and that would be, since the policy is documented in what is now going to be a consensus RFC, that would be a matter for community consensus to be determined.
Yeah, Alyssa, I totally understand, but we don't. The point is actually just to figure out where we might want to go. The draft basically calls for the LLC and the ISG to maybe bring some ideas back to the community, and then to take it forward from there. So sort of step by step. And if we need to make changes in documents later, we do that later.
Okay, Bob.
Hi, Bob Hinden. So nice report earlier. I'm glad we're on budget. So I was looking at the budget, and in particular, I was comparing it against the previous year's budget. And so what I noticed is that the previous year, the total expenses were a little over $7 million, $1,029,599. But the expenses for this year, basically the first LLC budget, was almost $8.7 million. So pretty much $1.6 million more to have the LLC. And it seems like quite a lot to me. So I have two questions relating to this. I'd like you to tell us why it's going up so much. And I'd also like to know why you didn't talk about this ever earlier. Because it's a pretty significant change. The difference is close to the cost of a meeting and a half of IETF meetings. This is a lot of money.
Sure. So I'm going to defer to our treasurer in a second. I would say that the budget was developed by the interim board, so it was established, late last year, and I think has been discussed, since that time. But Sean, do you want to speak to some of the cost differences?
I think some of the cost differences come down with trying to figure out who was doing what to whom with respect to ISOC and paying for things, and it's basically trying to just lay out what the real costs were, and that started before, and we're going to continue to do that going forward.
Well, that's a pretty general answer. I would like to sort of get a lot more specifics on that to understand this is a significant increase in the overhead costs of the IETF. So I think, I'm not expecting you to do it this second, but I think some more responses of why these extra expenses are being incurred and what we're getting for it, and why it's justified.
Yeah, go.
Thank you.
I'll take a note. Thanks.
Yep.
So we can follow up in more detail, but just a few things. I think, as you know, Bob, the IETF budget has increased every year, as long as I can remember, not by this much, but it's not as if the entire increase is attributable solely to the transition to the LLC, because it increases every year. We did talk about this when we were forming the LLC and, in the working group process and in the interim board. I think I'm the only person here who was on the interim board. So there was a bunch of discussion about this at the time when we created the budget a year ago. And obviously a bunch of it is accountable to salaries that we budgeted for this year but aren't actually paying out because we haven't hired the people. We didn't know the timing of the hiring, but we had to budget as if it was a whole year's worth of expenditure, even though the people haven't been hired. And then lastly, just to note, our revenue also increased significantly because we got a much larger contribution from ISOC this year than we have in any prior year. So it's not as if we're in danger of being underwater as a result of this. So.
But good questions. We'll take it as an action item and follow back up. Additional questions? We've got a couple minutes left.
Mike Bishop, I wanted to follow up on your comment that the endowment needs to grow further. The endowment webpage has not been accepting donations since around the end of last year, and now the endowment webpage, as of sometime very recently, gives you a cert error and then a 404 if you proceed past that.
Yep.
I kind of think if we want more money, we might want to start accepting it.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. We made a decision to, and during the transition period for a short period of time, take that down because it would be unclear what bank account it could be accepted into, and it was difficult from an accounting and sort of paperwork standpoint to have a definite cut date for moving it over. I think we also felt that we wanted to have a chance, and there'll be community consultation, of course, with this, to sort of articulate what the long-term goals are and to, explain this and put up a new page and so on. So, that's going to go out eventually to community comment. And, we're in an interim period. But I agree, you can't accept more money if you don't have a page to accept it. I think, though, at the same time, a lot of the places that we're going to go aren't places that might donate on a web page. So, it depends what our target audience is, and that's part of that assessment that we'll do.
Do you have a timeline for that?
Certainly, hiring and some RFPs are probably in the queue beforehand. It's next few months, I think, is our goal. So, and last comment, and then we have to close up.
Harald Alvestram. In what way are two contracts that define two functions and the interface between them simpler than one contract that defines two functions. I mean, I was a bit confused by this striving towards making more contracts, because my experience is that more contracts creates more interfaces, which creates more confusion, which creates more trouble. And the last thing you want is trouble. And it's micromanagement by the board. Care to comment?
Yeah, I know. I don't think it's micromanagement at all. I think it's us doing our job to reduce risk and make things more clear and simple. And in particular, I think that it might be one perspective to say that, you know, 2 contracts is more complicated than 1. But at the same time, when you come in and you look at an agreement and you try to figure out, well, this service is this particular thing, which of these pages does apply to that? It's very complicated when over time you keep adding to an existing contract. And at some point, the underlying contract isn't fit for the purpose of some of the add-on services. And so we're trying to bring clarity here. It's not about micromanagement. And, you know, we're trying to, again, make it more clear and easy to understand over the long term.
So I would be very happy to see you hire someone who knows how to run contracts and interfaces between them and give them the power to decide. So yes, do figure out what the functions are, but when it comes to the legal stuff, leave it to professionals, please.
Yeah, I hear you. We definitely have a legal counsel, and that's a core part of our remit. Thank you. All right, thanks very much for your time. Yeah, I think we're closed in terms of time, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Henrik,
So,
Henrik, please send your question to the list. Henrik, I did see you there. Thanks.
Adam, do you want to start introductions?
Sorry, yeah. Okay,
Can you
thanks for
introduce
jumping
yourself?
directly into introductions. I'm Adam Roach, Art Area Director. Ben Kadek, Security Area Director.
Mia Kulevin, Transport.
Suresh Krishnan, Internet.
Magnus Westlund, Transport.
Erik Wag, Internet.
Barry Liba, Art.
Alyssa Cooper, General Area.
Ted Hardy, IAB Chair.
Warren Kamari, Ops.
Deborah Brungard, Routing.
Martin Vigo, Routing.
Roman Janelius, Security.
Alvaro Rutana, Routing.
Ignas Bagdonas, Management and Operations.
Alexei Melnikov, Application in Real Time.
Okay, reminder to the ISG, we're aiming for 1 respondent per question or comment. Let's see if we can do it. Leslie.
Thanks. Leslie Daigle. Just following up something from your report, Alyssa, I want to say thanks to the ISG for recognizing the issue with regards to tone on mailing lists and so on and so forth, and also taking on some responsibility for addressing that. But I think I'd also like to say, we are you and you are us. It was interesting to hear that you've had some input from professional communications management people. I'd be curious to know what it was that they shared with you, and could you share it with us? And in large part because while I recognize this is the ISG, this is the current ISG, in March there will be a slightly different ISG. So it's sort of like educating all of us educates not only this ISG, but all future ones too. Thanks.
Totally. Yeah, we were super lucky that this man, Mike Hoy, was able to drive over from his house and meet with a few of us, but definitely plan to distill everything that we have learned and will continue to learn so everyone can benefit from it. Martin.
Yeah, Martin Thompson.
To further Leslie's point, I think that I'd personally like to make a commitment here, and I encourage others to do the same. I felt constrained in the recent discussions. I didn't feel like I could say anything. And I realized recently, partly in the conversation with Mike that we had earlier this week, that standing by and letting this bad behavior occur is me being part of the problem. So in addition to me being respectful of others and the diversity of opinions that we have here and the great set of people that form this community, I plan to be less tolerant of bad behavior in others, and I'd encourage others to do so as well.
Thank you, Martin. Dan.
Dan Bogdanovic. About some feedback from last year NOMCOM member. Recruiting candidates for AD positions is really hard, as you probably know. But I really want the whole community to hear that, because lately it was a very interesting comment that I heard when trying to get some people to nominate for AD and asking them if they would be interested. Oh, it's a career death sentence. I still want to do development work. We have to think about that, how we can solve that. The other part also, what the ADs are saying, well, there's one thing that is in the job description, and the other part, what is the actual work that we have to do. There is a very specific way how to lead a volunteer organization. And we have to think about that, learn how to do that, and then based on that, grow and groom, the potential leaders. But I don't think this is enough to be discussed within the NOMCOM or within the ISG. This has to be a wider problem of the whole community. Because at one point, the people who are rotating through their leadership positions will retire. And then what?
Anybody want to respond to that? I think we agree with you. I think hopefully no one up here feels like it's a death sentence, but to the extent that people feel that way, that's a major issue. It's been an ongoing discussion in the ISG, and we would welcome the discussion with the community about it as well. Okay, I'm going to cut the mic line because we're supposed to stick to 10 minutes, and Kirsty, you're next.
Thank you, Kirsty P, NCSC. So I just wanted to echo some of the comments that have been said about conduct. It's been really good to see that being taken seriously at this IETF on mailing lists as well. I had a suggestion. You did mention before ways to prevent or tackle bad behaviour, and your idea here. So I just wanted to pitch my idea, which was to create an everyday sexism style, but everyday IETF. So for those who aren't aware of the Everyday Sexism Project, I recommend looking up on Twitter. It's just where people can submit their experiences where they relate to sexism and harassment that they experience. So I'm proposing, just as an idea, an everyday IETF, not limited to the sexism and harassment you might experience, but poor conduct and various difficult behaviours you might encounter. So I would just put that forward as an idea following the Everyday Sexism format. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. So I'm very happy to hear that this community is starting to take our internal conduct more seriously. We do a lot of work in the public, and we are an extremely unrepresentative sample of the people who depend on our work. And there are a lot of people who might be interested in being here who are turned off by all kinds of stuff that happens here, partly just the technical jargon. But the aggressiveness that we sometimes treat each other, even when we know each other well, is really off-putting, especially to some newcomers. So I think we would do well to take that seriously and think about the way that the conduct not only has an effect on those of us who are here, and I'm sure we've all been burned by some of this conduct, but I hope that we're thinking about the conduct in respect to the people who aren't here and whether we want more people to join us.
Thank you.
Janai Iyengar. Martin and DKG have basically said everything I wanted to say, but I'm going to say it again because it's worth repeating. I've been with this community for 19 years, and I don't really pay attention or listen to the IETF mailing list. I'm not saying this because I'm proud of it. I'm saying this because I can't keep up with what I see on the mailing list oftentimes. Separately, I want to applaud, well, I won't. I do want to say that this is, what I saw on the slides was very encouraging. This is, to me, the leadership taking some action on sort of figuring out how to deal with conduct, but what I saw on the slides was more of a safeguard against unprofessional behavior, actually making this place positive and encouraging for others to contribute in is something that the community, each one of us, has to do. And to that extent, the minimum that I can do is to make sure that if I see somebody being abrasive or continuously abrasive, I will call it out. I'll at least talk to them, and I'll try to make sure that it's considered.
Thank you.
Mark Nottingham. I have a suggestion. I don't know if it's a good one, but I think it's worth thinking about. And John referred earlier to the IETF main list. It's a free-for-all. I appreciate the focus on behavior that we're seeing. This is really good. But I can't help but wonder if it's really representative of the community anymore. Anecdotally, I hear of a lot of people who don't subscribe to it because they find it too gladiatorial, toxic, whatever word you want to use. And as a result, I wonder if we're getting good technical input there, especially regarding IETF last calls. That's one of the purposes of the list. It's supposed to be the community's review of the technical work that's happening here. So to me, it seems like we should have a list that's dedicated to that purpose and more heavily moderated than the IETF main list, so that the participants who can't put up with that level of whatever it is can still go and have a voice in last call discussions. I know there's some downsides to that, but I think it's something we should take seriously and consider.
Here.
I'll take the applause and lack of booze to support for what Mark said. I support it also. I think the discussions that happen on the IETF list are important discussions, and while they may veer off into the weeds and particular discussions might be annoying, on the whole, we need it. But I agree completely that we should make the last call comments and the threads that come out of that have their own home. So I would like to support that. I'd like the IASG to do that.
Yeah, we're going to seek some more feedback on that suggestion. Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our 10 minutes. So thank you, ISG. And next we have the IAB.
So if the IAB could go ahead and come up so that we don't have another shift after Olaf speaks, that would be good. Thank you very much. Cindy, can I ask you a favor? There's a monitor behind me that is producing some noise that's causing my hearing aids to go crazy. If you can see if they can turn that down or off, that would be very useful. My apologies, we're having a lot of AV adventures tonight. I think I'll just start doing it from this end while they fill in. Stephen, introduce yourself, please.
Stephen Farrell.
Yark.
Chambian Lee.
Christian Wittemer.
Jeff Tensor.
Alyssa Cooper.
Ted Hardy.
Wes Herdiker.
Melinda Shore.
Mark Nottingham.
Brian Trammell.
Colin Perkins.
Heather Flanagan.
And now I would like to introduce Olaf Kolkman, who will go through a short review of the 6635 structures and process.
Hello. My name is Olaf Kolkman. I work for the Internet Society, but I don't speak on their behalf, and specifically not now. I'm here as the former acting RFC series editor, and also as a co-editor of the current model, the RFC editor model version 2. There's something to unpack in here. The fact that there is an acting RFC series editor, or there has been an acting RFC series editor, and that the RFC editor model is on version 2 means that this is part of a longer conversation. Here's a first disclaimer. I am not going to tell you the whole history, and I'm not going to perform exegesis on all these RFCs. The intent is to give you an idea of specifically the people who are new in this room and new to this conversation, what we are talking about when we have the discussion at the mic lines in a few minutes from now. So part of a longer conversation, a conversation that started 50 years ago and that has gone through several iterations in trying to institutionalize it in a way that is suitable for the community, the broader community. This model, documented in RFC 6635, has now been in operation for about 7 years, I believe. The first ideas around this model are documented in RFC 4844, and it basically describes what it is that an RFC editor is expected to do. So what I'm telling you today is a bit of a combination between RFC 8444 and RFC 6635. So when we talk about the RFC editor, we talk about a function that used to be performed by one person, but that has evolved. And what the RFC editor essentially does, it takes raw input text in the form of internet drafts, and it spits out RFCs. That is the most simplistic way of thinking about the RFC editor. But of course, there is structure to this. First, where does the input come from? The input comes from you in the form of IETF documents as approved by the IHG, IRTF documents as approved by the IRSG, the IAB documents as approved by the IAB, and the independent documents as approved by the independent submission editor. The independent submission editor is a part of the RFC model that we're discussing, but I'm going to shift that apart. This is all input. This is not part of the RFC editor. The RFC editor simply is sort of designed as like this. And I realize I'm talking about boxes and about and these boxes, of course, there are people behind this. So apologies by putting it here, like this. First, your internet drafts get into the system and they're copy edited by the RFC Production Center. The RFC Production Center produces an RFC and gives that RFC to another entity, which is the RFC publisher. And they publish the RFC and archive it. Those two functions are currently operated by one contractor, which is AMS. And you all know Sandy and Alice. They are the people who, for instance, work in the RFC Production Center. Then there is the RFC Series Editor. The RFC Series Editor is the person that has a number of functions with respect to the sort of long-term strategy and the management of the entity. The responsibilities of the RFC Series Editor are strategic leadership and management of the publication and production functions. So that is managerial oversight, but also strategic leadership, thinking about how these functions evolve. Representation of the RFC series towards the IETF and others, including the development of RFC-related policy in the wider context. This is what Heather has been doing, and the report that you just saw was an aspect of that. Development of RFC production and publication. So how do we evolve how we produce RFCs and how do we publish them? The errata, for instance, is an example of that. And the development of the RFC series itself. Discussions about streams, about new types of content coming in. Many of these functions are ultimately overseen on behalf of the wider community by the IAB. The IAB has a chartered responsibility in oversight of the RFC series. And the way that it is implemented is that the RFC has created, the IAB has delegated a lot of the responsibility to the RFC series oversight committee. This is sort of how the oversight and responsibilities are working. So at the bottom, you have the two sort of the production and the publication function. The contracts maintained, the contractor is AMS. And contracts in this diagram are all with the LLC. That was, of course, the IOC when this RFC was written. So that's the orange lines or the lines that come from the right. I'm not quite sure if orange and green is seen by everybody, I just realized. But those are the lines coming down from the right. Those are contractual relationships. Those are budget oversight matters. RFC 4844 speaks about administrational oversight by the IOC and policy oversight by the IAB. And so the strategy and substance is overseen by the IAB, but it is all in conversation, of course. It is developed in conversation with the community at large. And there's a bug in this slide. The community at large arrows go one way, of course they should go two ways. There is interaction. That is supposed to be a conversation. The RSOC is a program or committee of the IAB. The idea at the time was that the IAB is a rotating body, and in order to give longer term and strategic guidance, it is important to get people in there that have a lifespan that is longer than the IAB itself, and one has the ability to put people with specialized background on that function.
Excuse me, Olaf?
Yeah.
I'm surprised not to see the RFC series advisory group or the independent submissions editorial board.
That was in my speaking notes, and I was about to say the astute observer would say there is no RFC series advisory group. That's simply because the model doesn't prescribe that group. It is an advisory group that is acting on behalf of the RFC series editor. The behest of, what is the right wording here? So if you hear about the RSEC, the RFC series advisory group, that would be a box that is hanging off the RFC series editor, but really informs that function. That is the oversight that I wanted to give. I hope that informs the discussion for the people who have never heard of these functions. I'm not going to take clarifying questions. Thank you very much. I'm going to get from the stage.
Thank you very much, Olaf, for putting together this slide deck and giving this background. As I said in my email earlier, the IAB is primarily here to listen. So please, if you have advice for us at this point, please get to the mic lines. Lucy.
Lucy Lynch. So I thank Olaf for this. There are some places in the model and that I might argue with him a bit. I actually think the RFC editor is a role, not just a function. I actually think the series in itself is a box, along with the IAB and the IASG. I think it predates the IETF. So for me, stewardship of the RFC series and protection of the independence and the integrity of the RFC editor as a role are extremely important. So I have a couple of questions for you, Ted. speaking for the IAB. What do you think the role of the series is? What do you think the role of the RFC editor is? And what is the responsibility of the IAB as stewards of that asset?
So I think one of the things that changed in the RFC editor model version 2 is that some of the things which had historically been associated with a single role were moved into multiple roles. And one of the protective functions of the RFC editor has historically been to provide a mechanism to allow people who are not part of the IETF standards process or one of the other kind of common ways of producing documents of interest to the internet technical community to publish. And I think we took that aspect of the RFC editor historic function, and it became the independent series editor, which has its own editorial board, and became one of the input streams. So I think to some degree, I certainly agree with you, the RFC editor is itself a role, but it's also a role that has been shared among multiple other roles in this current model. Now, you asked me what I thought the role of the RSC editor is, and the way I look at it from a metaphor perspective is sort of like a town planner. If you think about what we do, we're the construction workers. We build the houses. What the RFC Production Center does is they come through and make sure that everything in the houses is up to code. And if necessary, they help us bring it up to code if it isn't. The role the RSE plays is more like a town planner. She doesn't get into the details of whether any particular document is up to code. She helps make sure that the codes are modern, and she helps make sure that the outputs from the city are well connected to the rest of the world, that the roads coming in and out of the city, in this case, the publication venues in which the RFC publications are understood, that all of those work well. So from our perspective, it's a very, very important role, and it's at a level that most of us don't operate on a day-to-day basis. We're mostly the construction workers. We're writing a draft. We're mostly building the houses and interacting on a day-to-day basis with the code inspectors. So as stewards of that function, and as Brian Carpenter has put, the kind of stewardship that's involved in that has gone through multiple steps. The main thing that we have to do as stewards is to make sure it keeps going. We're not experts in town planning. We're not experts in publication. Our job is to make sure that with the community and with the RSOC that the function keeps going so that the individually built houses, each draft, remains part of a functioning whole, the city or the series. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It also explains to me a little bit why you may have a more limited view of the editorial capability that provides that integrity, independence, whatever that is needed, speaking for the Big I internet community, not just the inside the box community.
Okay,
Thank you.
and I appreciate that. I will say that it's never a good idea to let the people who are building the houses to write the code. There's always a risk there. You do want independence, and I recognize that. So I think that the order was actually John was next, and then up to the front microphone. John? No, please go ahead.
We ended up with the same question, so John was. If it's okay. Oh, he's done. Thank you.
Excuse my deteriorating voice. Ted, I want to start with a brief observation about Ola's presentation, which is that when the RSOC started, and I was very much part of it at the beginning, it saw its role as assisting and aiding the RSE to perform well and make certain the overall function worked. And at some stage, that seems to have shifted into what's now seen as a oversight in the management sense role. And I don't know what started that shift or how we got there, but I noticed that the IAB has, over the last several years, completely repopulated the RSOC. And I'd like to better understand why that was done and how the mandate and your expectations of the RSOC and the RSE changed in the process.
Thank you. So the RFC 6635 doesn't actually tell the IAB on what schedule to repopulate it or how to do it. And so the IAB has done it on a periodic basis, essentially in the past 4 or 5 years, every 2 years, and looked for new volunteers or looked to refresh the program. The last time through, we did a standard program refresh, which means that we called for volunteers for the whole program, got many volunteers who'd already been on the RSOC for some time, and some new ones, and then asked for community commentary, and then went through the process of selecting some and populating the new RSOC. As you notice, that we've definitely heard from the community that that might have been the wrong thing to do. And we've proposed to the community that we switch that, if there are not more major changes, to a rotating membership for 3-year fixed terms with renewal that makes sure that we never refresh all of the RSOC again at any one time. And I think that that is sort of a structural change that will help make sure that the lessons we learn from this aren't as easy to lose. Because I do think you're right. One of the things that happened here was the standard meaning of oversight more and more came into play in the understanding of what the RSOC was meant to be doing. And I think in particular it occurs when you're around these moments of contract and contract renewal. And it's because in those cases it causes people who have standard business arrangements to say, hey, I understand what oversight means when I'm making a contract, or I understand what oversight means when I'm hiring a person, that we lost some of the nuance that what oversight was meant to mean was something different here. And I think that what we're looking to figure out, I mean, obviously this whole process has been a forceful reminder that the community has a different expectation here, how we make sure that this becomes reflected in the documents in a way that it's part of the structures. Because it's pretty obvious, we had people with 5, 3, 2 years of experience on the RSOC, but the lore didn't get carried forward in the program enough. I think it has to be in the documents themselves. And I think we've referred to that as kind of one of the structural things that happened here, where the way the document was written and what it talked about as oversight had very basic hiring and firing kind of oversight in it, and other things that describe the role in different ways. And the tension between them has now been manifested in this tension, and we need to fix that.
In addition to that, and I will make this very brief, there was a shift from expecting there to be serious publication strategy expertise on the RSOC that got lost somewhere in the process. And that also may be a matter of not having written things down enough. It may be a matter of not enough institutional memory on the IAB, but to the extent to which one wants that historical, quote, oversight, end quote, role, there has to be expertise there, which is above and beyond very sincere members of the community want to help with this.
Thanks for the feedback. I appreciate it. Kathleen, I think you're next.
Okay, so my question is for Ted and Alyssa, and I'm going to ask this multi-part question retrospectively, but it's more with an eye towards how do we bake this into the process going forward and make sure that it's considered, because I think it will make a difference. So was risk management considered in the decision process? And by that I mean, were the potential outcomes enumerated with the possible outcomes and, possible outcomes and potential business impact and remediation options as to inform a business decision? And I ask this as I've been a CISO multiple times, right? So I've had to go through this type of process every time some sort of large security decision was being made. And another part of that was the LLC consulted, since they own the contract, or the trust, which I'm on, so I know we weren't, but we own the published RFCs.
So let me go backwards in that.
Yeah.
The way the process is currently structured, the LLC part of the process had not started when this information came into the LLC and to the IEB that the RC was not renewing her contract. And so they were not...
Before the recommendation letter went
No.
out, like, okay,
No.
so I think having risk management started at that early phase could have helped, but I'm asking that to Ted and Alyssa, not to the RSOC, because I view this as really a level above that in terms of where are we placing risk management functions, and having a process that goes up through the business to people who are responsible, right, to make those business decisions.
Thank you for the comment. I think I might need to follow up with you a little bit more offline about exactly how you're modeling risk management, because I think what you mean by it might not be quite what I understand it to be, but given the mic lines, if you don't mind, I'd like to take the further details.
And that's fine. I've done quite a bit of work in this space, so it's really just making sure it goes up to people in the business. It looks like Alyssa wants to respond as well, so I'd appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Sue, you're next.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Can I just, because she
Oh,
addressed
sure.
the question to me. I mean, happy to have more follow-up on this, but the one thing I'll say, and at least my understanding of RFC 6635, is like a very strong presumption of delegation to the RSOC for all of these matters. And I think that was by design. Like, why would you have two committees overseeing, having any oversight role over a single individual if they weren't supposed to have functionally different roles? So I think that's part of what gets to your question, is that there's a strong level of independence and delegation between the IAB and the RSOC, at least as I've understood it from the lore and the RFC.
Thank you. And I think it goes to some of the role definition and assumptions, and they seem to be a little bit different through the room.
Sue, now you're next.
Thank you very much, Ted. This question is for Alyssa. As you go forward, you've asked us to think about going forward. I'd like to see what your arc is in going forward. Alyssa, we had and you're in a unique position since you sit both on the ISG and IB, and I'm sure, Ted, I'd love to hear this from you, but we had an RFC++ BOF to work on our main output, which is RFCs. What was your conclusion from that BOF, and how did you come to it? Just if you'd share the reasoning, it would help maybe tell us what you're thinking about.
Sure. I mean, I think it was a bit more of an IEB initiative than anything else, but I think there was very clear feedback from the BOF that the topics that were raised were squarely in the province of the RFC series editor, and she agreed to take them on and work on them, and I think that was I mean, in the realm of, clarity of result from a BOF, it's one of the clearest results I've seen, so that was a good outcome. I think, the BOF itself was extremely divisive, and that's why I've, talked about it as having been a mistake, because I think it created, a lot of strife that was unnecessary. But in terms of further follow-up, it's entirely in the RFC series editor's court.
So as we're transitioning that, did you feel the directions that Heather outlined were the appropriate directions? She outlined several things she thought next, or even this time she outlined Auth 48. Does that seem to be the same sort of thing you foresee for the future?
I don't think the Auth 48 topic was really related to the BOF.
No, it wasn't. I was just giving it as an example that you might elucidate what things you felt in the BOF would be good going forward, what positive things.
So I don't think the Auth 48 topic was related to the BOF, but I will say that as far back as a year and a half ago, Heather and I were talking about the RPC performance evaluation, and this was the main topic that came up, that it would be great to get going on revisions to Auth 48. And I knew that it was sort of as the next project after the format transition. So from my personal individual perspective, I think that seems like a fantastic next project. But it's not really, my opinion isn't really the one that matters. It kind of depends on the community and what the population of people who are working in the IETF stream want.
Okay.
So I'll be interested to see if it's a project of interest to other people.
Those sound a bit tactical. I was hoping for a strategic comment. But thank you. I'm sure maybe you'll give us some strategic forward how we make the stream more effective, more than just the processing through.
Sure. Yeah, the strategy for the RFC series is not my responsibility. So.
Okay, so I think Tony is next. No, Leif? I'm not sure who's next.
Maybe it's me. All right, Leif Johansson. Or somebody else?
No, it's you.
I'll go. So earlier today, Sarah sent out an email to the IETF list with an apology from the RSOC, and I just want to say to you that I think that was a stand-up thing to do, and thank you for it. I think it sets a very good example. There was a couple of things in that email that caught my eye, and one of them was talk about how the current situation came to be as a result of wanting to test out an RFC process. Because there was some uncertainty around sort of the earlier application of it. And as somebody who's sort of does this for a living, managing RFPs as a large part of my day job, there's no such thing as to test an RFP process. You either run it or you don't. And in the kind of contracts that the various parts of the organization manages, none of them, as far as I can see, are for a square meter of something, a standard service. It's all special purpose. It's all one-offs in various forms and shapes. And you have to be very much more careful when you manage and buy those kinds of services. So what I'm here to ask is there anything else on the table? That we should be worried about. Are we going to be here in Singapore or in Vancouver looking at other breakage? Because there are other people in the community who are affected by contracts. The NOC people, tools team, not all of them are reimbursed directly or contracted, but a lot of them are affected by contracts that the current IETF leadership is negotiating in various sort of constellations. And I just want to make sure that we learn from this, not only in the RFC, future RFC process or the future hiring of this particular function, but in other parts of the organization, so we don't break anything else.
Thank you for your comment. And I think the good news is that none of the other contracts are held in quite this way, where there's this recommendation, appointment, and then referral to the LLC. I think they're mostly a good bit simpler than this, but I'm sure that the LLC board members here who are listening to the point you've made, and will try and avoid making this kind of error.
Because there were a couple of, Sarah actually had a couple of points in her email. One of them was, we're looking at an RFC where we don't understand what's going on. We need to test it. An RFP, that's a Freudian slip. We're looking at an RFC. We don't know why we didn't go as expected last time. We're going to test it. I think that's your number one mistake. Right? The number two mistake, of course, is not communicating properly. Right? And I'm not actually directing this at Sarah. Of course, I'm directing it at the entire iStar leadership.
So with my IETF LLC hat on, lesson I learned was to call your contractors and thank them and make sure they'll submit a bid.
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean,
so I did do that.
My final point, I've done the same thing with vendors that I manage. Not to extend their contract when I had the option. I've never done that when I was happy with the vendor. Never, ever.
We hear you, and I think you've seen from Sarah and from the RSOC that wasn't the intent, and we apologize. Sorry, going to the back mic. Is that Ron?
Yeah, that's Ron.
Sorry.
Sorry, I've been in line before.
Okay, then Mike and then Ron, sorry.
For a while.
Okay.
So I've been trying to pay attention to the timeline here.
Mike, you need to get a little bit closer.
I've been trying, okay, that close. I've been trying to get Mike St. John's, I've been trying to get an idea of the timeline here, and we've been working our way back through all this stuff. Could the IAB members of the RSOC identify themselves, please? Okay, cool. So I went back and I took a look at the RSC, RSOC minutes, and there were only 2 discussions on this particular topic. One of them was that because the ISOC HR person back in 2005 had said you may not evaluate the contractor, you would come up with you're going to evaluate the contract. But someplace in the middle of this, you basically went off and decided that the evaluation of the contract was also to do a rebid. So who in this process was the prime mover for the rebid, and what discussions were done besides, it looks like the last meeting and maybe 2 meetings prior, and that topic was just the evaluation criteria, as near as I can tell, just because it was listed as executive session.
So let me caution you about something related to the executive session. In addition, of course, to the executive session, there is an executive equivalent mailing list, so you're probably not seeing the full record because some of it may have been, since it is a personnel or contract matter on this. So please understand that because we have to treat these as confidential, even when the intent is to be laudatory toward the person, some of this is not in the public record and can't be put there. Now, going back to the timeline question, Christian, do you want to take that?
The timeline is what you said. It was discussed in the last 3 months, about, no more.
And it was discussed at 1 meeting. And you came up with the decision to do the rebid in 1 meeting.
We had discussion before, and we were really concerned that the RFPs only produced 1 bid.
That was a 1.5 years prior. When did that discussion happen?
No, those discussions happened in May.
So could I ask you to clarify why you think the timeline is particularly the primary issue here?
I'm trying to figure out how much thought went into this process of deciding to do this. And I'm trying to make sure we don't end up with let's just do the RFP without, just somebody randomly deciding to do this. So I need to understand, was there any discussion of this and the impact of the rebid? And I'm not seeing that in the record.
So, and I think what you normally see in this case is an output. And I think I've talked to you about this on mailing list, but I'll repeat it here. Because this is something where it relates to a contract or in similar cases with personnel matters, you normally judge these by output, not by rehearsing the discussion in public. And in this case, the output was a recommendation for renewal. Now,
and this was a consensus recommendation from the entire
I'm going to go on. In addition to that recommendation for renewal, they brought back up an issue that had occurred, including in discussions from Heather, that the last time that they had sought candidates, they'd received only 1. And at the same time decided to make a concerted effort over the following 2 years to figure out what had happened and see if they could issue another RFP. Now, we've noted in the previous things here that was certainly a mistake in communication, in communicating those at the same time, because it was completely misunderstood as something that was reflective of Heather's performance, despite it having caveats about that in it. That's a mistake, and it was, I think Sarah has been very clear about that. It was also something where I think in response to Leaf, we certainly agree that that's not how this should have gone. That instead, we understand that what we should have done here, and this is a broad we, is make sure that everybody was on board with that process, including Heather, before making the decision to do the rebid
and perhaps
early.
including the community.
Including the community as well. But at that point in the process, the only part that had happened was the RSOC recommendation, and then the RSC's resignation. So some bits of this that might have corrected this, and it would be kind of fanciful to assume that we actually got this right, didn't happen, and that's where it went wrong.
And did the IAB at that time reach out to Heather to request her reconsider while this was still private?
So the information came to the IAB, pretty much at exactly the same time that she told the LLC board. Sarah did reach out to her right away. I sent her an email personally, but off list, saying thank you for your service, and intended to reach out to her after I got back from the debtor workshop to discuss further. But because I was, literally in Helsinki on a plane, getting on a plane, I couldn't get more than that. But it is definitely the case that we have heard that this did not go right, and we will see what we can do to make sure that it is structurally prevented from failing in this way again. Ron.
Hi, I'm Ron. 3 comments. First, thanks to Olaf for his slides. They make a very complicated process look really easy, and it looks like a process that should run. Second is I don't think we're quite ready to put out an RFP yet. And the reason why, this process looks like it should run well. It didn't. It failed in a spectacular way. The people standing around the microphone are trying to debug the process now. What happened? What went wrong? Probably the people who can debug the process best are the ones who executed it. They should probably do a postmortem, figure out what went wrong, who made the mistakes, be honest about it. We learn from our mistakes. The next thing is, can we undo the damage? Is it possible? If not, can we at least admit to the mistakes and not repeat them? Once we understand where the process went wrong, we can make sure we don't do it again. But we shouldn't leap into the process again until we understand why the router crashed.
Thank you for the feedback. I'm going to apologize for this. I kind of wasn't tracking who was at which microphone at what time, so I'm just going to call them serially. Patrick, you're next, and then it will be Bob.
Thanks, Ted. I'm going to try and be responsive to the question of where do we go from here, right, and provide some input into that. I think the core issue of what we have to deal with right now is a result of asking the RSE to simultaneously deal with these issues of strategy and administration. And it's not surprising when you think about what the core work product of the IETF is and how leadership is responsible for greasing the wheels to make that happen, that the RSE is the nexus of a lot of discussions about not only the strategic evolution of the series, but also, the SLAs that may be behind, the format that everyone wants yesterday, yada, yada, yada. And if the iStar was not responsive to that, I would be at the mic saying, hey, what about the SLAs, right? Because that's what I need as output from my work when I come here. So that creates this inherent tension. And we should deal with that rather than putting a new person immediately in a place where the same tension exists. And I think the strategic, I think the more operational parts of RSA have, in many ways been moved out to the production center and the publisher as up here on the slides. Forgive my hesitation of talking here. The feedback here is amazing at this microphone. The operational parts of that have largely been moved out, and I think, the RFCs will continue to flow should this position be vacant for, a short period of time, while we deal with the harder strategic questions. And then once if you manage to separate those roles, you can ask the question, and I've heard wildly divergent opinions on how you structure someone that is only dealing with strategic questions there, right? Have we now created a leadership position that looks a lot like the other leadership positions we have? And so this shouldn't be, a hired or a contracted position. This should be an appointed position, and then you would have more of a peer kind of relationship. And as soon as you create that other model, you necessarily bring management into that. And is that a tension that's not survivable? Can you carve off enough of that so that it's leadership more consistent with the model we already do? I'm not asking you to solve that tonight, but I'm saying those are the questions I would like to see solved before we jump in with a new, long-term relationship.
Thank you for the feedback. Bob?
Hi, Bob Hindit. So, regrettably, I was standing at the mic the last time we were here in this hotel, talking about what happened at the RFC plus BOF, and it's only gotten worse. I mean, you're the management of this oversight, and this has been a giant failure. Olaf's presentation was quite good, and he said something very important. He said the RSOC was supposed to be the people with the long-term history in this, so things didn't change very quickly. I mean, that was the intent in setting this up. And when the IAB decided to cycle a whole bunch of people in the RSOC, you lost all of that. And that's, I think, what led to the events that caused us to lose a really good person who, to lose Heather. It was a series of errors that, come back to a bunch of things the IAB did. So where I'm going with this is I have no confidence that the current RSOC and the current IAB are going to run the process to get us the next RFC editor in the way we want. I think there's going to have to be some significant changes in this to get the right set of people involved in this so we get a good outcome.
Thanks for your comments. A couple of clarifying comments for me, and then just to move on to the next person. The way the IAB program structures are worked, not just for RSOC, which is one of the oldest and best described, but all of them, isn't to try and keep the history in the people in the program, but to keep the history in the structure of the program. The idea is that by creating the structured program that lasts longer than any IAB 2-year term, that there are always enough people in it who have been in it long enough that the structures of the program keep things going. In this case, the IB did do a refresh that called for new people, but it actually kept 3 people with a total of 11 years of experience in the RSOC. So I think it's important to note that they weren't either going and using this in a way, or we were not going and using this in a way that's different from the other IAB structures, or that the people who stayed in the RSOC hadn't been there some significant period of time. What I do think is a very important strategic question, and I certainly agree with you that we should deal with, is whether this is still the right structure. It may very well be that having an RSOC that is directly appointed by the NOMCOM or from some other mechanism that's tied to the stream managers or some other thing may be a better solution now. I think the most important thing that we can do from this point, though, is to figure out how we get to that strategy. And if it is not run the RFP process and hire somebody to help us, then we have to understand it will take some time for the community to come to consensus on what the new strategy ought to be. Eric, you're next.
I'm really pretty sure they were ahead of me, so I'm happy to go, but.
I'm just going to do this because I can't keep
Sorry,
going.
I have a few notes. I was interested to hear the discussion of what people's conceptions of 6635's intention for the RSOC were. I went back and reviewed the material. So I assume that the documents actually document what they're supposed to document. This seems like a pretty classic oversight function to me. It has like due diligence, annual review, candidate selection, all those things. So if someone gave me the definition of oversight, that's what I'd expect. And so it's what I expect the IEB to do for the RFC function, and it's what I expect that given they've chosen to delegate that to RSOC, or the community's chosen to delegate that to RSOC, and with IEB overseeing them, it's what I expect RSOC to do. So I certainly think the IEB should be responsible to the community for their ultimate decisions, but I certainly would not be happy if what the output of this was that the RSOC and the IEB, every time they made a decision, had to go back to the community for validation of every individual decision. That seems non-functional. The structure we have in this community is we trust the leadership to do things, and then when they don't do them, we have structures for removing them in various ways. We don't assume that they double check everything with the community.
Eric, could you speak a little bit slower?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. I thought we were running out of time.
We are running tight on time, but we are also trying to listen.
I'm sorry. Should I start from the beginning?
No.
Okay. Secondly, I want to say is I wanted to sort of thank you for what you just said earlier about the sort of the structures that we use for continuity. It's really not a viable system to assume that continuity has to reside in like a few individuals who then carry on forever. That like doesn't work. And I mean, we make this mistake in the IETF over and over again. We like think that like we have to put exactly the right person in, and like the way one builds like a viable long-term system is by having structures, not by having the great man or great woman theory of history. This is from my experience in the companies I've worked in. That's not really survivable as people leave. Finally, I think it is clear from this interaction that the structure and the sort of grand strategy of what the RFC system and those boxes on the screen perhaps may need some rethink. I was heartened to hear Patrick say that, that if we don't solve this problem right away, the RFCs will continue to flow, and I agree with that. I mean, that's what we're here, so the RFCs must flow. So, yeah, I thought you'd like that. So I think certainly that gives us some time. It's not like an emergency. So I think, we have a broad scale. We have sort of two options. One, I think the one that Ron just indicated, which is take a pause and don't appoint anybody new for a little while and sort of try to sort out in the community what the RFC, what the structure ought to be. And the second is, to appoint somebody for a shorter term, perhaps who could help us sort out what that ought to be. And when the RFC process is indicated 60-35 to pick that person, but with the expectation that we're going to sort things out rather than that like they're fitting into some long-term final structure. I think either of those would be viable, but I think clearly whatever it is, like we do need to ask the question, is this the right strategy and structure going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. I understand Heather would like to say something.
So with regards to RFCs flowing, absolutely a priority. So yes, I have a very tactical role, and the RFC also has a very strategic role. The tactical role is an immediate need that you need to consider. We've been talking about the format change. There's going to be day-to-day questions about how do we handle different things that will need to be answered ongoing and fairly quickly. We've already added a new state in the database so that we can track, as we track edit time, we tracked RFC editor time, we track auth48 time, and now we're going to track tools time, where something is stuck in a state where the tools aren't quite right, that they need to change. Regardless of the long-term direction that the organization takes, and I do suspect you need to spend some quality time with that, someone needs to be able to help the RFC Production Center with those day-to-day, what about this field? So please keep that in mind.
So can I ask you this question in a slightly more direct fashion then? Is it your advice to the community that we do not pause the RFP, but we do seek to hire, even if it's only temporarily, successor RSC at this time?
No. I think trying to find, telling the tools team perhaps to take this part and run it, I think trying to find an interim person is going to be wildly difficult for anyone you bring in for them to be able to do that job. We run an XML vocabulary that's like nothing else in the world. So I don't see you'll be able to find an expertise to do this role. I think you'll need to get it from within the community and then spend some time with the bigger picture of what do you actually want to hire for going forward.
I see. Thank you for the clarification. I think, Richard, you were next.
Hi, this is Richard Barnes. So I'd like to sound a bit of a note of positivity and thank the IAB and the RSOC for the oversight they've been doing. To me, oversight is about when you're in oversight of a role, it's about backstopping that role and paying attention to when there might be question marks or signs that things might need attention. And I think that's what I've seen out of the IAB and RSOC is fulfilling that role. Thinking back, the last few times I've been at this plenary mic, including perhaps like right on this spot, have been expressing concerns about ways the RFC series needs to evolve, whether that's in terms of SLA violations or speed of processing, or in terms of reaching out to stakeholder communities, the consumers of RFCs. So I think there have been question marks that have come through, and I think it's the duty of the oversight bodies to be looking into those and taking a look. And so I'd like to thank the RSOC and the IAB for doing that and invite them to continue fulfilling the role that they've been chartered with in the relevant RFCs. And so in that regard, kind of disagree with this idea that there's been a deep structural failure. I think if we've had a disagreement, and there's been unfortunate consequences of that disagreement, and we'll need to come together as a community and think about how to move forward and come to better consensus on how we should operate in the future and avoid these sorts of disagreements in the future. But I don't think there's a kind of deep structural failing that some other speakers have mentioned. And so in that framing, I'm a bit more optimistic than some other folks about our ability to carry on here and kind of stay the course. I think I broadly agree with the two alternatives that Ecker raised. We could have kind of a brief appoggiatura and take some time in breathing room and have a brief vacancy while we as a community discuss this. But I also think that I'm slightly more persuaded by the case that we should go ahead and try and find an interim. As Heather points out, there's some operational issues that need attending to. I think it would also be useful to have someone in that role to kind of guide the community discussion and be kind of a focus point for this conversation as we discuss the evolution going forward. Yeah, I think, again, I'd like to thank the IAB and the RSOC, and I think either of these two options is acceptable, but I have a slight preference for going ahead and putting a candidate in the spot.
Okay, thanks for expressing your preference. Aaron.
Hi, Aaron Falk. So I completely disagree with Rich. I think there's been a failure here.
You need to be a little bit closer to the mic, Aaron.
Okay, it takes him a second to turn the volume up. So I think there's been a failure here. I disagree with Rich. First, let me apologize to you publicly, Ted, if you felt that I was harassing you on the IETF list. I got some feedback that maybe I wasn't clear with what I was trying to get to, and I was trying really hard to not put words in your mouth. But I was asking, did the IB think anything went wrong? Was there anything that could have done differently? And I think that there were things that the IB did wrong and could have done differently. But first the response was, there was nothing wrong, the IB was regretful. Then you said that you thought the mistake was that you hadn't realized that Heather wasn't happy. This evening in this discussion, you said that, well, maybe the IB made a mistake because they made the change to the RSOC constitution or membership. I think those were, in fact, mistakes. And I was, but I don't think you're, or the IB is arguing in bad faith about the sense of the stewardship role for the RFC series. I've been on the IB in an ex officio capacity in the past, and I've always had that sense that the IB felt like the RFC series was part of the things that it was responsible for. However, I don't see that the IB has really acted like it was responsible for the RFC series, right? An interruption in the RFC series or a major disruption in the RFC series, you're responsible for that, right? You're responsible for the RFC series, and now it's being disrupted. It's being disrupted because the RSC has told us that she had the impression that her customer wasn't happy with her. She sent that, and maybe you can confirm this, but I believe that she sent that to you before it went to the larger community. So why didn't you find out why? If you think that she misunderstood how the community felt about her performance, why didn't you try to rectify that? Maybe, if you were happy with it, if you thought there were no issues, why didn't you convince her of that before her resignation went public? If I had a valued contractor, one that was critical to the operation of my company, and they said they were leaving, I would try to turn them around. And so I see that as a real failure of stewardship on the IAB's part. I have two positive suggestions to move forward. I think that the RSOC members that were removed from the RSOC should be added back in. They bring expertise, history for searching for an RSC. They've done this before. And I think that the RSAG and the ISCB bring a lot of continuity and expertise in the RFC editor specifically, going back to when Bob Braden was RFC editor. And I think you should take advantage of them, even if they aren't on your picture. Thank you.
Hi, this is Hannes. I was in the IEB when version 2 of this model was created, and Olaf presented it fairly nicely, although still incomplete, but it showed the complexity of all of this. And when it was written, I had the impression that it was overly complicated for what we are doing in the IETF. We are publishing technical specifications, and this to me looks like Wiley as a sort of a publisher. And I would encourage the IAB to look into simplifying that model, because I think part of the problem is that so many parties involved for something that is just not big enough. We just over-engineered this process.
Suresh?
Yeah, Suresh Krishnan. So, first of all, I'd like to put positive stuff first. Like, yeah, thank you, Heather, for your service, and thanks, Sarah, for the apology. I think it really changed the tone of the conversation. And one thing I want to say is, like, if we want to change what 6635 does, we need to change it. I think it's like pretty tight to talk about right now, like to say, like, okay, we're going to revisit this. I think it's going to be a difficult call to make, specifically related to what Aaron said, right, for the disruption of the RFC series, pretty much. So I think we should, at least for this cycle, continue with the RSOC, doing the selection, and the IAB approving it pretty much, as said in 6635. And one thing I want to say is, with the RFC++ BOF, I think one of the learnings is, we need to connect to the community that we have that's consuming this stuff. And a lot of the community is here, okay? Like the IETF is here, the IETF is here, the IAB is here, obviously. But there's also other people outside, who are not here. And I think some of the stuff that came up was we're not listening to them. I think we should make an effort to reach out to the other people who are implementing our stuff and using our stuff to also find out the needs. I think some of the stuff that Heather mentioned, right, the inline errata kind of thing, those are really something that we need. And I think taking all these things into account, I think is a really good idea going forward.
Jeffrey, you're next.
Jeffrey Yaskin. On the topic of leaving the series editor position empty for a period, we're getting the new RFC format soon. It sounds like it's still going to be being debugged when we lose Heather at the end of the year. And leaving nobody in charge while that new format is still being debugged makes me nervous. Now, Heather and the other editors know best how to deal with that, but I wanted to raise that as a worry.
Thank you. Cullen, you're next.
So when I first heard about this and started digging into it, my first reaction is, wow, something must have gone wrong here. I want to figure out what it was. And I went back trying to read all of IETF at IETF list, and that made me realize that we actually had a much larger problem than this, reading that list, and there was a reason I didn't read it. But after I worked on it for a while, I think that when we've heard this from multiple people, what we do going forward is by far more important here. And I worry, sometimes we have a very frustrating experience and then we make reactionary adjustments to it. I caution us to proceed in a rational way that thinks about this stuff and sets up something that wasn't a reaction to a mistake or something that happened, but instead is a better way of doing this. I heard suggestions like the 3-year rotating term to keep continuity and those types of things, and that sounds like a very logical type of thing. I also think that we should think that it's very normal for any one of our groups that is responsible for contracts that are one of our most expensive budget items in this organization of producing the RFCs, that we would, even if we thought that the contractor was doing a wonderful job, that we still would ask about other prices for it periodically. That would be a normal oversight I would expect from any business group spending a large chunk of money, is you'd occasionally check that you're getting the best things you could. So I think that's pretty normal. I had a very hard time seeing a very specific problem with the structure. It seems like our structure is in many ways similar to any other structure we'd invent. But I do think we have to give more guidance on what we want out of it and sort of step back as a community, think about what are the things we can do to improve that, and then make those happen over time. Thanks.
Okay, Henrik, you're next. I think the mic lines have not drained. I'm not going to try and cut anybody off. But at some point, we may need to move everybody to the front of the room so that they can start resetting the back. So if folks who are in the back, if you could consider moving front to allow them to do that, that'd be good. Henrik, you can start the thing by coming to the front. Thanks.
It's there.
Okay. Henrik Lev-Kovacs. So
Yes, I think something went wrong. I think we need to look again at the setup of the RSOC and the process. But I have one particular question for Ted. And I may be wrong, but I seem to recall that on the RFC++ BOF, the two new IAB members on the RSOC were quite vocal in proposing quite dramatic changes. Did you consider that putting them on the RSOC might be a contributing action to conflict within the RSOC and something that would spill over and make Heather unhappy?
So I think that we sent a message a year ago, pretty much exactly, about the output of the RFC++ BOF and acknowledged that there were not just one, but I think I count 7 mistakes in it. Among them, some of the early consultation issues. And it's clear that there was an 8th mistake, and that was at the end of that, we were very clear that the community wanted Heather to take the lead in the further evolution discussions and not us. And we thought that that was done. Apparently, it continued to be a source of frustration for her, enough that when a later frustration, this last straw on the camel's back, it was one of the things she cited in her message to the community as one of the issues that had caused her to decide it was better for her to go away, that we were no longer aligned. We didn't think that it was any more a question of alignment. We thought we had aligned with the community on that, and it's clearly a mistake that was not sufficiently communicated to either her or the community that was no longer something we were either advocating for or expecting. That answer your question?
Not really, because my question is about the potential for a built-in conflict or built-in tension in the RSOC as a result of putting 2 people who had been vocal in advocating quite big changes on there. They were potentially not.
So neither of the people who were put on the RSOC were proponents for the BOF, and one of them wasn't even on the IEB at the time. Right.
No, I quite clearly recall Mark being very vocal in the RFC++. Am I wrong? Am I mistaken?
I'd love to talk to you more about that because that's not my recollection.
Okay.
My recollection is that we should talk because that's really not my recollection, and I'd like to understand where you get that.
So there are some different perceptions there. I'll talk more.
Leslie.
Okay, thanks. Leslie Daigle. So I have a question for you, either you, Ted, or you representing the IB or whatever. Then I want to give my answer and then answer your question about filling the slot. So the question is, on a continuum from the RFC plus BOF to now, I think we can agree we've encountered some uncomfortable situations with the RFC editor and the RFC series. What do you think good looks like?
I'm sorry, I don't really understand how I can answer that retrospectively.
I'm not asking you to answer it retrospectively. I'm offering the past year and the discomfort as the problem that has to be solved. So, given that, what do you think good looks like?
So I don't think we can get back to the status quo ante given what's happened so far. So I think what good looks like starts by having the community come to an agreement about whether they want to bring in an RSE to help the future discussion now, or as close to now as we can make it, and with the acknowledgement that John had brought up earlier of needing to stretch beyond the increasingly small number of people that's in this room. And after that, to finish the community discussion of what changes need to happen here. And I think, given some of the issues that Bob Hinden raised, those changes might in fact mean that it's no longer the IAB which appoints the RSOC at all, that its role changes quite significantly as a result of this. I actually think that the right thing to happen is to make sure that the community believes and has the structures in place to make sure that the function goes forward in the future. Whether the IAB remains involved in that or not is not nearly as important as making sure that the community has confidence in those structures.
Okay, thank you, because I think that was definitely responsive to my question, and my answer to the question aligns with much of it, if not all. My answer is that a year from now, I would like the IETF and the internet technical community as a whole, which are impacted by this situation, to have confidence that we are all on the same page about what the RSC is, what the RFC series is, and that the people who are making the decisions not only agree with what that is, but are also empowered to make it happen. I think that from my perspective, the RFC plus BOF in some ways broke my confidence that I and the IAB actually have the same view of what the RFC series is, and that confidence is not yet restored. I'm not sure that it's going to be addressed by structural issues, but I lay out getting to confidence as the target. Again, I want to reiterate that the fact that that we have lost the contractor for this role at a time not of our choosing is actually a problem not just for the IETF, but for the broader internet technical community that this series is meant to serve. And I'd really like to feel more confident that the IAB remembers that as we go forward. And then finally, to your question of whether or not to attempt to repopulate the RSC position at this time, the only thing I would say is if you elect not to do that, please put a hard time limit before you will, because if we just say when we have consensus, it might be a while.
That's a very important point. Thank you. Rich.
Yeah, an observation with no value assessed to it in terms of judgment. You're the only one who's spoken. Thank you.
So, Rich, that was largely to make sure that we were not all trying to speak and therefore taking more time with us talking than listening. That's why.
Thank you for the explanation. Could have. Okay, fine.
Hi, Brian Dixon, GoDaddy, longtime listener, first-time caller. So, looking at this with kind of shock on my face, I apologize, but I definitely want to extend my thanks as just an ordinary participant. The way I would look at the RFC series editor position would be potentially more akin to like a C-series suite type role. And the RSOC role, I would say, better would align with like a board of directors. And a board of directors for a corporation has the best value when it has a lot of stability. And I don't know what the rules are, how the constituency of the RSOC is maintained, where they're drawn from, et cetera, et cetera. But I think having a better dialogue with the RFC series editor on the constituency and the long-term direction, and having much less change occur, and having it be not duration driven, but more responsibility or vision driven, like it would be in any kind of bigger board type thing. There's no reason not to that I could see, and I would say that along with that, as much as the RFC series editor is a paid role, I do not think it should be viewed the same as a contractor. It should be viewed as a semi-limited role with the expectation of, as long as it's being done well, it's up to the decision of the RSOC to replace or not, but it shouldn't be driven by a particular scheduling or duration of contracts. I think restructuring it along those lines may have a better result in terms of the people you attract and possibly even who you can retain. But that's
so do you mean an employee relationship? Is that what you mean?
Yes. I mean, look at it exactly the same as an employee relationship for a CEO. The CEO reports to the board at the will of the board, but is expected to retain that role unless there's some mutual disagreement or reason to leave, or contractual disagreement.
You'd like to get a quick response, but please make it quick.
Sure. Very quickly, I think that we've had some discussion on the IASA 2 list, and during that discussion I expressed opposition to the idea of the RSC as an employee, various reasons that are on that list. So I think there's the rest of your comments I totally agree with, but that part, no, for me.
Eric? Eric Nygren. Meta comment / concern. I think I see there's kind of watching some of this dialogue and watching some of the conversations in the IETF list and looking at it as a observer. I see some of it. I think Ecker alluded to this in one of his comments of the community trying to do, I don't know, incident review by plenary or micromanaging people we put in a leadership role by plenary or trying to do design by plenary, and it's unclear how constructive that is. I think at some point we have a set of people that we put in a leadership role, and having been in those sorts of roles before, trying to have the whole community kind of second-guessing decisions that were presumably made in good faith is not really a healthy way to run the community. And at some point we have to assume that the people in the IAB and the RSOC are acting in a good faith leadership role and are listening to the inputs and comments that we're giving to them, but trying to go and have the entire community micromanaging and trying to second guess every single decision has a risk of creating an unhealthy environment, an environment where NomCom was asking earlier, like, hey, we have trouble getting people into leadership roles. We should be asking ourselves if people who are in those leadership roles are feeling like if they make a mistake and then say, sorry, we made a mistake, and start trying to, in good faith, look at what they did to make that, to kind of made that mistake and try to figure out how do they improve that going forwards. If people feel like even that they do that, the entire community is going to be constantly second guessing them, it's going to be hard to get people who are going to be interested in going into leadership roles going forwards.
So just to quickly respond to that, while I certainly hope that everybody believes we're acting in good faith, being in front of the plenary and answering questions to the community and listening to the community is one of the primary accountability mechanisms that has been built into the IETF. And I think that probably the worst possible result of all of this would be losing it. So I think as much as this is a difficult way of getting things done, we need to listen, and we need to listen in public.
Hi, I'm Adrian Farrell. I'm the Independent Submissions Editor. Some quick thanks. Thanks for you staying up there, facilitating this and risking your blood sugar levels. Thanks to Olav for what turns out to be a really helpful slide set. Along the way, Olav mentioned the 4 streams that feed the RSC series, and I think, Ted, you introduced a term that hadn't come up from Olav, which was the stream managers. So that's the people responsible, in some inverted commas, for the streams. I wondered, along the way, lots of decisions have been made by people on the platform at the moment and elsewhere. And in the future, lots of decisions are going to need to be made as well. What efforts were made and will be made to consult the stream managers about those decisions?
So I think that this is one of the structural changes we may have to make, that the way that the system is currently set up, the RSOC and the stream managers don't actually have a good interface other than just talking to each other. And that it may be necessary to institute a much more structural relationship if that's what we want to see.
Yeah, so I think maybe if that's what we need, because just talking to each other should work just fine.
Okay.
Brett Jordan, some of the comments tonight have referred to Heather in the abstract. She's a person, and I think we need to realize that we are losing Heather. And I think that we should thank her for her sacrifice and her service. And more care and feeding of your employees would be really good on your part.
Well, if we'd like to do another standing ovation, I'm certainly willing. Levez les mains.
You all have the capability of being very kind.
is that negotiated? Aaliyah Atlas. But the point he's made is something that I would also like to touch on. In Heather's note and in the discussion here, it's clear that there was not enough open communication and checking in on her and on the concerns that had been raised. And I would like to know what your plans are for checking in on all of the other incredibly critical contractors and volunteers and making sure that they are not in similar states.
So that's a really good question. We do have some methods of working with AMOS folks in less than formal structures, and I think those are avenues where we could potentially learn of that, but it's probably something that we need to work with the LLC board on, since the IEB actually doesn't have formal relationships with many of those other contractors. But thanks for raising the issue.
Not just contractors, volunteers, and also they're people. We talk to each other, build a team. I mean, it's the formal and the informal, and that's what I'm hearing was missing. Thank you very much.
Okay. Richard, I know you've been up at the thing before. Please make it as short because we've got a short amount of time left.
No, I'm seeing Alexa showing up looking threatening. I'm happy to yield to John because I think he was up before me.
I've also been here before. This will be very brief, but I've heard something a couple of times tonight and a couple of times on the list which needs clarification. If I decide to go down to the local hardware store and buy a kilogram of 10-penny Canadian standard nails, because they are Canadian standard, there's a Canadian standard for 10-penny nails and a Canadian standard for kilogram. I know what I'm getting, and if I decide to go to the next hardware store and do price comparisons, I can do that in a reliable way. If we start talking about bidding these contracts on a competitive price basis, we are in deep, deep trouble because we are insulting the people whom we would most want to do the jobs, and we are going to get ourselves exactly what we deserve. So let's be very, very careful about a vocabulary which starts talking about recompeting these things periodically to get a better price.
Thank you. I think that the point was made on the list that in the past these have never been actually evaluated on price, and I think it's unlikely that we would ever go to that point. Richard, you're next.
Yeah, I'd just like to briefly revisit some points that were made earlier about the composition of the RSOC and say, perhaps unsurprisingly, I have a little bit more positive view than has been expressed here. I think the current RSOC has a good blend of experience and new thinking, folks representing different aspects of the community. So I'm actually quite pleased with the current RSOC, and I feel like they've been, as I said earlier, doing a pretty good job of oversight. I'm also deeply uncomfortable with another notion that was raised here of consulting the broader internet community. As Christian pointed out on the list, like it's really hard to get to the whole internet. The internet's really big, and as we're seeing here, if you look around the room, we're having trouble getting the committed IETF community to show up for these discussions.
So can you repeat what she said because nobody up here could hear it?
Yeah, please, Leslie.
I said it still represents the entire technical community, whether or not you can consult it. It's part of the RFC series. We actually don't get to redefine that.
But I mean, at some point we need to represent people, a concrete group of people, and the needs of the concrete folks who are showing up in the room and doing work and producing these things, and the people who are using, and the community of people who are using them to get good work done on the internet.
We're listening at this point. He's stated his opinion. We can move on. Henrik, I think we have to go ahead and say we're done taking new people in because we're now seriously over time, like over an hour over time. So I'm going to drain the queue on this side since it was already occupied. Elliot?
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, IAB, for staying late. And I'd like to also thank colleagues here who I think generally that we've had a pretty positive discussion here, and I think we should all recognize that. I can see that there's still a lot of passion that people have, and there are ideas that they haven't had the opportunity to express. One of the things I think the most important question I have is where do we go from here in terms of how do you want to structure the conversation going forward, Ted?
Okay. I think that the short answer is we're probably going make a very quick decision about whether this needs a new mailing list or whether we'll reuse RFC interest. After that decision, we'll write up a short reflection on this meeting and post it to the IETF, RFC interest, and if there is a new list, to that list, and put out the rest of the discussion from that point. I have a strong belief at this point that one of the key risks that Heather articulated was that if the ball gets dropped during this period of transition in the format, there may be a set of issues that makes it even more difficult to bring somebody in afterwards. As a result of that, I think the most likely result here, even though there were very clear articulations for why we might want to wait until further community discussion occurred, that we will probably say that having the ability to overlap with Heather is probably an overriding concern. But that's the reflection that will go to the list for further discussion. Yes. Eric, you're going to have the final word.
I will be incredibly quick. 2 points. Yes. Generally, in our technical designs, we try to avoid single points of failure. I would encourage people to think about that as we go forward in terms of structure. Second, the primary purpose, is, what Hannah said, of this organization is to publish technical specifications, and whatever structure we choose has to serve that ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me add at the final moment a thank you to all of you who came to this part of the plenary and gave your thoughts to each other and the IAB and the RSOC on this set of points. I realize it's been a very emotional couple of weeks for many, and I also appreciate the collegial and professional manner you all participated in. Thank you very much.